Well, look, I must say after a fantastic session yesterday, I come to you with a deep sense of humility. And the reason for that is that I've been, as I'll explain, thinking about an approach to dealing with excess CO2 in the atmosphere that is going to, I think the approach will unfold over the next 12 months. And I'd really like your assistance in assessing whether it's the right thing to do, because all of these big drawdown projects, they're planetary in scale. They have a lot of consequences. Essentially, the project that I'll be carrying out over the next 12 months builds on the work of James Lovelock and Chris Rapley, who published a paper in Nature in 2007, suggesting a mechanism for drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere in scale and sequestering the carbon in the oceans. And that mechanism was pipes, 100 metres, 200 metres tall, in the ocean with a one-way valve on the bottom that would bring cold, nutrient-rich water to the surface, prompt planktonic plumes, planktonic growth, and then hopefully we'd get some sequestration. So why are we thinking about approaches like this in 2019? Essentially because I think the problem has now grown so large that we simply can't deal with it by cutting emissions. We're way past that point now, as I hope you'll see from the presentation. So we have to do two very big and difficult things at once. We have to cut emissions hard and fast, and we have to draw CO2 out of the atmosphere at scale. So just to give us some sense of where we are today, this is a lovely piece of art by a Melbourne-based artist, an Australian artist called Steve Haley. He works by buying files from computer gaming shops and then illustrating a truth. And in this illustration, he has shown us the number of barrels of oil extracted from Earth's crust every second, of every minute, of every hour, of every week. You get a sense of the Amazon-like flow of hydrocarbons coming from our Earth's crust into the atmosphere. Add to that, of course, coal, which would dwarf that volume, and then gas, and you get to see the scale of the problem we are creating every second. I and many other people in this room have been involved in trying to deal with this problem for decades. And I hate showing this graph, but it's really essential that we do it. You can see here atmospheric concentration of CO2 versus time, and plotted on the graph are all of the interventions, the scientific interventions, the political interventions that all of us have been involved with. And if you can discern an impact from those interventions on that trajectory, you're a better statistician or an analyst of graphs than I am. We are headed for catastrophe, and nothing we have done has changed that. This year, or over the last 12 months, we added 3.5 parts per million to the atmospheric concentration, a record number. Our burning of fossil fuels and emissions of greenhouse gases increased 1.7%. At a time when Jim Hansen tells us if we want to stabilise at 350 parts per million, we need to be cutting emissions by 3% a year and drawing down 3 gigatons of CO2 per year. So what this graph tells me is that the current approach is not working. We need something different and radical, and we need to do those two very big and difficult things at once. I'll be talking about the second of those two very difficult things, the drawdown. The reason I've been concentrating on this over the last few years is that almost no significant work has been done in the area. We've had some theoretical things, and Chris Rapley and James Lovelock's work really, in a way, sparked that off with a mechanism, indicating a mechanism that we could use. But since then, we haven't had a lot of action, whereas at least on the emissions cutting side, we've seen massive growth of renewables, which is starting, I think, well, one hopes will have an impact in coming years. So my, I suppose, interest or expertise in this area has come from, in large part, participating in the Virgin Earth Challenge. I'm one of the judges on the Virgin Earth Challenge with James Lovelock was a judge as well until recently, Al Gore and Sir Crispin Tickell. And what the Virgin Earth Challenge was a £25 million prize for a technology that has the potential to draw a gigaton of carbon out of the atmosphere in a year. Now, we had 11,000 entries to the prize. I didn't look at all of those. Some of them were totally off the scale. But I did look through a significant number. And we got to see the scope of possibilities that are out there in terms of drawdown. There are really only two pathways to draw CO2 out of the atmosphere at scale. There's the biological and chemical pathways. There are a few other options, but these are the principal ones. So the biological pathways we're all familiar with. The source of the energy is free. It's the sun. Photosynthesis uses that energy to break apart CO2, and we get the carbon drawn out of the atmosphere. Chemical pathways, we have to pay for each of those, for the services, either pay for the energy or pay to utilise that energy. So the carbon silicate cycle, one of the chemical pathways, very important one, can be accelerated if we put energy into the system by grinding up rocks. Carbon negative concretes and so forth, they're carbon negative because they're using the byproducts of coal combustion. So if you included that past coal combustion, they wouldn't be carbon negative in many cases. Some carbon negative building products actually use biological material and sequester it long term as well. A number of approaches there. And things like direct air capture, very innovative approaches. And actually operational at some sort of scale at the moment. So Carbon Engineering is a company that takes atmospheric CO2 and makes biofuels, very clean burning jet fuels from it. Just one example of direct air capture. The biological pathways, there are really three destinations that you can store the carbon in. Reforestation, we hear a lot about. Soil carbon. The soil carbon store is about twice as large as the living carbon store in the forest, so it's very potentially important. And seaweed farming. Now, having scanned really all of those options that came up during the Virgin Earth Challenge, I could see that the chemical pathways were many decades away from yielding gigaton scale results. That's just a factor. A gigaton is an enormously large volume. Building the capacity to draw down at that scale using the chemical pathways is, in my view, way into the future. Reforestation, we hear a lot about it. Very, very valuable, no doubt about it. The problem that I have, though, with using the land-based carbon stores is a scale problem, scalability and security of storage issue. So scalability, trees start as seeds. It takes decades before they're drawing down large volumes of CO2. The land surface is already severely overexploited for human needs. Do we have enough space to grow forests and store carbon at the gigaton scale? I think I'm sceptical. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm sceptical. Soil carbon, likewise, there's potential there and we should be exploiting it, but on the gigaton scale, can we do anything? Again, I don't know. But seaweed, I think we can do something. And seaweed is very different from land-based crops, and some of the properties that it possesses, I think, open the door to real long-term storage. The first thing to notice is the oceans are 70% of Earth's surface. They play a critical role in the climate system, and could we grow seaweed at scale across them, we could be growing a climate-altering crop. Seaweeds are among the most diverse of all multicellular organisms. They're among the first to have evolved. Chemically, they're very, very varied. They're already used for many purposes. There's a $6 billion seaweed industry out there at the moment, producing everything from high-quality pharmaceuticals and medical products that sell for $15,000 a kilogram, through to feedstock for animals, and of course, for human food. You can even take a seaweed bath, as I've done. It's supposed to be good for the skin. I don't know about that, but it was certainly slimy. But to look at the issue of scale, I think that, as I said earlier, only mid-ocean kelp farming offers us secure storage and the potential for scale. A study done by Ramon Nyert from University of the South Pacific, desktop studied, indicates that if we covered 9% of the ocean in seaweed farms, we'd produce sufficient biomethane to replace all of today's fossil fuel energy and remove 53 billion tonnes of CO2 per year from the atmosphere. It's about what we put in now. Produce enough marine protein to provide 200 kilograms per year per person for a population of 10 billion. and reduce ocean acidification. When I read that paper, I thought this is potentially very, very important and needs to be investigated. First thing I did was look at how big 9% of the world's oceans is. It's about 4.5 Australias. That is scale, yeah? We're not going to get anywhere near that scale for many, many decades to come, if ever. And I'm not even sure we should, but it gives you a sense of what we're talking about. So how many ocean-going seaweed farms do we have at the moment? Because that's what Njert was talking about. The answer is 0. We don't have one. We have a prototype that's being built at the moment, and that prototype illustrates some of the characteristics of seaweed farming in the mid-ocean. So this is an illustration, a diagram of the thing. You see the seaweed here. It's growing on a rack, submerged 25 metres into the ocean. Very clear in the mid-ocean. It's a biological desert, but you don't want ships bumping into it. And of course, this crop is really different from land-based crops. There is no bark, there's no trunk, there's no non-productive parts of the seaweed, effectively. The whole thing is a photosynthetic sheet. And as a consequence, it grows very fast. It can grow 1 metre a day, bull kelp, given the right circumstances. And the sequestration, the place you'd put the kelp to sequester it long term, is just below, 1 kilometre down. If we can get the seaweed 1 kilometre down, it's out of the atmospheric system for centuries, maybe even millennia. So we have the opportunity to grow the seaweed very rapidly and to sequester it securely. And I think on land we have questions around both. This is a key part of the seaweed farm. It's a pipe running down below the thermocline into the cool or cold and very nutrient-rich water which lays below. These are highly stratified mid-ocean. This water can be less saline than the water up here. It's full of nutrients, so the idea is to pump it up. You need about 2 metres of head pressure to bring that water up. Irrigate the crop, hopefully being less salty. If we can locate the farms in such places, we can grow the kelp by irrigating it and have that cooler water sit at the ocean surface for some time. What that means in terms of climate impacts is a question that I think we need to consider and think about. So this is being developed out of Woods Hole Institute by a group led by Brian von Hertzen. It's the first attempt to do this since the 1980s. There were farms like this produced by the US Gas Roundtable during the 1980s. They spent $2 billion growing bull kelp offshore in California. The lowering of the oil price destroyed that project, but we learnt a great deal in the 80s from that earlier generation. We're talking here about a planetary scale intervention, as I mentioned. Many things could go wrong. Piles of sinking seaweed on the beach are probably the least of our problems. One of the things that keeps me awake at night a bit is what would the consequences of growing seaweed at these sort of scales and sequestering it in the deep ocean be on life in the ocean deep? It's a question we have almost no insights into at the moment. We have one study, though, by Dr. Kraus-Jensen and colleagues about 18 months ago that looks at natural flux of seaweed into the deep ocean. And we do know that seaweed reaches the deep ocean probably on the gigaton scale. It's washed off continental plateaus and goes down submarine canyons. So seaweed is reaching the deep ocean at some volume. The question we must face is, what are the consequences of increasing that rate of flow? It's a natural process, but we'd be interfering with it. There's probably many, many other reasons we need to start, or consequences we need to start thinking about. This seaweed farm in South Korea is an existing seaweed farm. It gives you some sense of the scale of the current modern industry. So we're talking about moving this sort of scale offshore. The economics at the moment are they're interesting. These seaweed farms are increasingly becoming ocean permaculture farms. So people grow seaweed, but they also grow fish and other marine protein, shellfish and prawns, in the seaweed farms because the ocean water's buffered and it creates a really great environment for anything that's trying to lay down a skeleton or a shell. So rapid rates of growth. And increasingly in these places, a marine protein is a very valuable crop. You know, what we're talking about is if we take this offshore, we're telling the farmer to throw his crop away, effectively, to throw the seaweed into the deep ocean to sequester the carbon. We might retrieve some value from pyrolysing the seaweed, charring it, or digesting it in biodigesters. We'll have to, that is yet to be seen. But effectively, we're telling the farmer to sink the crop into the deep sea. That, I think, will require a carbon price. But the economics will be complex because they may be also developing or growing marine protein that can be sold at market. We'll have to see how these farms work. I mean, it may be that we'll have to have mobile farms. So instead of a great pile of rotting seaweed in one part of the deep ocean, we'll have a more evenly distributed product. We may need to char the seaweed before we put it into the deep ocean so we can retrieve some energy from it and create a mineralised form of carbon, of char, that will be less, or more inert, less damaging on the deep ocean. We just don't know as yet. So what is happening with this? We've set up a new foundation called the Ocean Forest Foundation to investigate how we might do this. We're holding a conference in the Netherlands, in The Hague, in July, early July next year, where we hope to bring together 1,000 or so people with expertise in seaweed growing, marine engineering, earth systems, the economics of seaweed growing, the regulations and taxation systems that might assist with this. And the ultimate view is that, you know, over the next 30 years, we will start seeing seaweed growing at scale and some drawdown at scale. You know, is that possible? Well, half of all of the carbon we've put into the atmosphere as a species, or since the burning of fossil fuels, has been put in the last 30 years. I'm enough of a technological optimist to believe if we put it in 30 years, we can get it out in 30 years. And if you think about what 30 years can do, just cast your mind back a century to 1919 to 1950, that 30-year period. You know, we went from having, you know, wood and canvas biplanes to jet aircraft, from having, you know, horse transport to automobiles, and from gunpowder to nuclear power. I mean, that was a revolutionary period of change. I think in this modern interconnected world where the carbon in the atmosphere, which won't come out by itself, it will sit there until someone gets it out, at least 25% of what we put in, that in this interconnected world, the drivers are there to see drawdown deployed. If we don't draw the CO2 down, each year we'll just visit worse and worse consequences on us. The facts of climate change are recognised sufficiently, I think, that we will have a carbon price at some point in the next 30 years, and that will facilitate drawdown. I'm not a betting man, but I guess we all only have a limited time, and I've had to try to choose an option that I think is the best option. I might be wrong. If in 5 years' time it turns out that there are enormous impediments in growing seaweed at scale, or that we shouldn't do it, I'll at least feel I've done my job. But we need to investigate all of these options, I think, to work out where we can get the biggest bang for our buck with drawdown. Otherwise, that graph that we saw at the start simply won't start bending down. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. That's very, very hopeful. So we've got plenty of time for questions. Please wait for the microphone if you would like to ask a question over here. Okay, so we have one here.
Thank you, very interesting. One comment with regard to trees is you can clone trees, and so they don't have to start from seed. And I have a question, but another comment is char has a density lower than that of water, especially seawater, so that's a challenge. But the main thing is the economics. So I've been to islands in Indonesia that used to grow seaweed, but the economics of tourism has displaced that. So I guess your comment about the price of carbon is going to be what drives this, unless you have what are the economics of this situation?
If I could just respond, I agree entirely. And you know, given the economics of seaweed, unless you're growing high value crops. It is, as you say, marginal and easily displaced. I think ocean permaculture offers a new hope there. But the problem for ocean-going seaweed farms, of course, is that you're further from market. So you're just adding cost, right? So unless the carbon price is sufficient to allow that, I don't know quite where we'll go. I think that the first thing we need is a map. We need to know where we can do this. It may be there are sweet spots near submarine canyons, near markets, near shore, where we can effectively begin to sequester the carbon in seaweed. You're right about the density of char. We're working with someone just running some experiments on charring seaweed because not a lot's been done in that space. But you're quite right, that's another challenge.
Another question. Peter, Liz, yeah.
Thank you. Peter Liss. I mean, yours is a geoengineering scheme, and like many geoengineering schemes, it doesn't pay enough attention to the unintended consequences of what you're trying to do, or thinking about doing at least. I mean, in the case of seaweeds, I mean, we know that seaweeds are some of the biggest emitters of halogen gases, iodine-containing gases, which are extremely reactive in the atmosphere. And so, naturally, that's all a balanced process. And so the halogen compounds react with ozone and balance that level of ozone, which is keeping the atmosphere clean for us. If you really did, the extent that you're thinking about, then I think you have to be really worried about what you're going to do to what we call the oxidizing capacity of the atmosphere. And it stresses that when you're thinking about these things, the Earth system science perspective, the Gaian perspective, is very important, because it's not just what goes on in the seawater, it's what goes, the consequence of that goes on in the atmosphere. So it's just a word of warning. I don't say it's something will ruin the air we have to breathe, but I think we should be very worried about that and do some research to find out.
Thank you very much. That kind of comment is exactly the reason I've come here today, to put this proposal to people, because we don't know. It's extremely complex systems. And if I could be in contact afterwards to learn some more, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a question here from Bron, and then Claire Belcher at the back, and Colin Goldblatt, and I think that probably will do it.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. It was fascinating, and I think you're doing really important work, because we do have to think about removing carbon from the atmosphere. At Lancaster, Andy Jarvis is also here from Lancaster. He's part of this project that I'm involved in, looking at the phenomenon of mitigation deterrence. So this is about the socially mediated possible side effects of greenhouse gas removal. And so mitigation deterrence is, the idea that even just the promise of this technology in the future, wow, 4.5 Australias, that'll solve it, might actually deter efforts to reduce emissions, or even sometimes, and you're talking about biofuels there, that it might actually produce a kind of economic rebound, and so you get rebound effects and actually more emissions accidentally. So at Lancaster, we're trying to identify both the mechanisms for those kind of bleeding of effects from greenhouse gas removal to reduced effort in other areas. So you end up losing carbon as you get carbon storage as you're gaining it, but also mechanisms to prevent it from happening. Such as keeping it completely separation between the accounting and the markets for carbon, emissions and storage. So I wondered if you'd thought at all about how to prevent those social side effects happening, which might undermine its effectiveness in pulling down all that carbon.
Look, it's a really great question, and I must say, I chaired the Copenhagen Climate Council up in 2009, and we saw, you learn a lot about the political process doing that sort of thing, and I came away from that meeting and I felt that that meeting was just about the last time we could deal with this problem by just drawing down emissions. And I must say, I wrestled with my conscience a lot. Do you actually put a proposal like this forward and open the possibility, as you say, of a get-out-of-jail-free card for the polluting industries? Or do you just remain silent? And as the problem's grown, I felt that I haven't had a choice but to put forward this proposal. I'm painfully aware of that get-out-of-jail-free card potential. But when I present on this, I do say things like we're in a new era of climate change. It's an era where offsets just don't make any sense anymore. When you've got to do two things at once, you've got to cut your emissions and draw down, you need to treat the accounts separately, as you say. Look, it's a really, really important area, kind of vital area, how we frame this and how we make sure we don't lose the benefits through taking the foot off the brakes. And again, all I can say is I'd love to have some expertise in that area, join our group and help work how we avoid that.
A question from Claire. Please keep your questions succinct.
So one of the thoughts that I had listening to this sort of seaweed permaculture is that our current ocean is on the edge of anoxia potentially already. So does it make sense to be burying more carbon in the ocean, because we might actually be forcing an oceanic anoxic event, which isn't really going to be very helpful at all for our climate?
Yes, that's one of the areas, again, I want to look into. And that transport of seaweed, that study was the first indication that I had that at least we've got some natural flux. How much we'll be increasing it is we don't know. But I think, is it going to be one of those things where we learn as we do? Probably. The system's complex enough that we'll have to learn to some extent as we do, and that involves risk. Yeah.
I guess the point is, do we have time to learn as we go? Do we need, playing around with the Earth system is maybe not the best idea.
Do you know, if anyone has a better idea, I would love to hear it, because I don't want to devote 5 years of my life to a no-go thing, honestly. But I really cannot see another drawdown option that seems scalable, it builds on an existing industry and it gives us security. If we don't go to drawdown, then where do we go? Do we go to geoengineering and just mask the problem for centuries until the Earth balances?
I would be more in favour of afforestation schemes, I think, because if we look back over Earth history, there have been a lot more trees on the planet naturally, so surely it makes more sense to be returning to something like that than playing around with the ocean. Anyway, that's just my point of view.
Can I just give you my personal view on that? I'm a paleontologist by training, and if you look at forests and megafauna, large mammals, the idea that Britain was once covered in ancient pristine forest, I think is wrong. It was a mixed, thorny bush, forest, open, grassland area. May have been very good at sequestering carbon. We don't know. And I would applaud all efforts to grow more trees on land. But the fact is that we're seeing wildfires, pine bark beetle infestations, increased metabolic activity in the soils, driving emissions. That stuff all seems to be going in the wrong direction. And to hope we can turn on a die and go the other way, at the gigaton scale, it just looked to me less possible than the seaweed option. I might be wrong. I'd like to be wrong, but...
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.
I think actually we better move on. Sorry about that, Colin. Thank you very much, Tim.